they have to look out for a liquidity horizon. Typically, BASEL has recommended a liquidity horizon of 3 months, but of course, it can be 6 months or even 9 months. For every investment in the trading book which is sensitive to credit risk or downgrading risk, the bank has to typically choose a liquidity horizon. Now, what they have to do based on this is, okay, if they have chosen it as 3 months, they have to watch it at the end of 3 months. That particular instrument they will watch at the end of the liquidity horizon. Let's say either that particular bond has defaulted or ratings might have got downgraded. Now, if at all any of this thing has happened, the bank has to do a replacement. That is where the rebalancing comes into picture. It has to replace that particular asset with an equivalent asset which is comparable to this AA rating at the beginning of the period, not at the end. There is a small loss that is incurred because of the credit downgrade, but obviously it is not resulting in full default. So you are basically taking a necessary action at the earliest itself rather than waiting for total default to typically occur. So this exercise is being performed at the end of every liquidity horizon, and that is where it's like a cautious approach in terms of identifying the problem at an earlier stage and taking a quick measure in terms of addressing that. And this kind of an assumption where they are actually going into the rebalancing every stage is what we are calling as constant level of risk. So they are trying to maintain a constant level of risk by rebalancing it. So because of this kind of a move in, there is a possibility that there is some amount of loss that is occurring, but the overall probability of default is drastically reduced, which means the 1 year value at risk, which is measured at a 99% confidence level, this number will go down drastically. And anything to do with the credit spreads, the specific risk charge SRC is computing what should be the typical charge that is associated with the credit spread. So the incremental risk charge was adding one more level of protection against the losses that are coming up, especially with the instruments which are there as a part of the trading book of the company, but which are more and more sensitive to the credit, either the default risk sensitive or getting exposed to at rating downgradation kind of stuff, right? So this is one more new thing that came as a part of BASEL 2.5. Then moving a bit more ahead, there is something called as comprehensive risk measure. The third thing which is a part of BASEL 2.5 is a comprehensive risk measure, otherwise called as CRM, which is a single capital charge, especially for correlation dependent instruments. Majorly, if I'm talking about the correlation dependent instruments, we can talk about the asset-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations of the asset-backed securities itself. Now for these, there is a single capital charge. There is nothing called a specific risk charge and incremental risk charge. All these are getting replaced by a single capital charge called the comprehensive risk measures, especially for those kind of instruments or those kind of risks which are a part of the correlation book. So this is where the BASEL 2.5 has come one more step ahead in terms of identifying those kind of instruments which are more and more sensitive to the correlation. Because if you look at a typical CDO and let's say a senior tranche in a CDO, in a no, and probably the senior tranche typically will get a AAA rating. And what we generally see is in the market, when the situation is very good, in the normal kind of a market, it's very rare that this tranche will default. So a AAA is very much apt for this. But just like the way we have seen during the financial crisis, this this tranche, because of its correlation with various other instruments, the correlations have widened drastically, and because of that, even these senior tranches had to default. Now, this is where the correlation, they are in normal conditions, they are not exposed to a risk of default. But when the correlations widen, especially during the stressed market scenarios, this is where for them the correlations are going to widen and the risks are going to increase. And to address this, for the rated instruments, especially we are talking about the rated instruments, it wanted to come out with a standardized approach. All the different rated instruments, there is a standardized approach that has come out. And this is where again a bifurcation lies, especially with those instruments which are securitized normally, like your mortgage-backed securities, and some of them which are re-securitized, means securitization of a securitization. Probably once an asset-backed securities are created, on the top of these various asset-backed securities, using the mezzanine tranche of the different asset-backed securities, another CDO has been created. So CDOs of the ABSs, they are like re-securitized kind of instrument. So what they have brought out is for these, the requirement is much lesser, the capital requirement is much lesser. But for these instruments, the capital requirement became much higher. And BASEL has simply come out with saying, if at all it's a highly rated kind of a tranche, anything from AAA to AA minus, under a regular securitization scenario, if it is 1.6% is the capital charge, under a resecuritization scenario, it would be double. Similarly, if the tranche is having a rating from A plus to A minus kind, and the remaining A rating, it is 4% and 8%. The more going into a triple B plus to triple B minus, this rating is resulting in 8% and 18% kind of a charge. And finally, double B plus to double B minus kind of a rating resulted in 28% under the securitization, 52% under the resecuritization. And if at all that particular instrument which is unrated or having any rating that is below double B minus, we are deducting the entire principal amount from the exposure for the computation of capital, which means we are talking about 100% capital charge for those kind of instruments. And this is where some flexibility is also provided, at least for these unrated instruments or unrated tranches. The banks have the flexibility to use their internal model, provided there is an approval. So the banks have the flexibility to use their internal model to compute the comprehensive risk measure for those kind of unrated tranches. But this internal model should be more and more rigorous. Lot of stress tests need to be performed. This entire thing has to be approved by the supervisors. and it has to be completely sophisticated in terms of the various rules that it is using. Under these circumstances, the banks have the flexibility to compute it on their own. It has to capture the risk that is associated with the credit spread, any kind of multiple assets that are defaulting, even that has to be captured quite effectively by this model. Implied correlations, whatever are getting derived, the kind of volatility that is lying between the various implied correlations need to be handled, and correlations versus the credit spreads. The model should take this kind of behavior into consideration. Any kind of rebalancings that are typically done, whatever is the cost that is driving this rebalancing, and finally all the recovery rates, what is the kind of volatility that is associated with the recovery rates. All these things need to be driven as a part of the model for computing the comprehensive risk measure. Then the banks are allowed to typically use their internal model, because on one side if you are looking at the Dodd-Frank Act, the first thing that they have completely discouraged is don't depend on the credit ratings for setting the capital requirements. Now, if you look at the comprehensive risk measure, it is very much linked with the credit ratings. So this is where the government is trying a little bit more in terms of coming up with its own model. So probably all these inputs can definitely add value towards the building of a very effective model which does not use the credit rating to come out and define a comprehensive credit risk measure. So that is how the BASEL 2.5 has emerged, and these are the various aspects that the BASEL 2.5 has considered and got implemented somewhere towards the end of 2011, right?